This is the Statice Seraph, a brand new set of pads from a new name in the hard pad market. Now, historically speaking, whenever a new brand releases their first product, and specifically when it comes to hard pads, the initial releases are often a little rough around the edges, so to speak. And while that trend is somewhat applicable here, at least when it comes to the pre-production units I've received, despite this, I'm still very impressed with the pads, as not only are they very well designed, they perform great, though they are on the faster side of the performance spectrum, arguably a little too much when it came to the coated version as it's extremely fast. But regardless, both versions of the Seraph are surprisingly solid pads, and the retail versions will be even better than the pads I'll be talking about today, as several improvements have already been made to them. And in today's video, we're going to talk in depth about the pad's design, performance, unique features, how the pads perform with various skate types, what aiming game types the pads are best suited for, how the uncoated and coated versions differ, and more about the improvements Statice has made to the retail batches, and much more. But before we dive in, a big thank you to Statice for sending over both versions of the Seraph for review, and a massive thank you to all of our channel members for their continued support. And as always, this review will be completely unbiased, meaning you get my honest opinion of everything I cover here on the channel, with no affiliate codes, brand bias, or paid promos. But without further ado, let's get right into today's episode of the mel0n Review. For testing parameters, I tested both versions of the Seraph for about a week and a half each, daily driving them for both work and gaming use. For skates, I tested a variety of skate types on the pads, including the stock skate options, as well as several types of aftermarket skates, some of which complemented the pad's performance profile better than others, and we'll talk more about the pad's skate compatibility and performance later in this video. And for arm sleeve usage, while arm sleeves were only needed on one version of the Seraph, I would still advise using an arm sleeve on both versions, and to my surprise, not only does the Seraph include an arm sleeve, its typing and performance is surprisingly solid, and we'll talk more about the stock sleeve and its performance later in this video. For versions, the Seraph is available in both a coated and uncoated version, both of which come in a full color design featuring art drawn by mel0n. For sizing, the pads are currently only available in one size, a 490 by 420 by 2.5mm version, and for pricing, and to my surprise, despite the two different typings, both versions of the Seraph retail for the same price, retailing for 81 USD or around 115 Canadian dollars, which is a very solid price considering the pad's quality and all the accessories that come with it. And in today's video, I'll be reviewing both the coated and uncoated versions of the Seraph. But sadly, as of this review going live, the pads are currently out of stock, as stock was depleted a couple days after I received my review units, but Statice said they'd be restocking their pads in the near future, so hopefully the Seraph will be available for purchase again very soon. Now, as a preface to this segment, since my units are pre-production units, the pad's base, packaging, accessories will differ from the retail versions, so keep that in mind. Now, starting off with packaging, both of my pads came in plain cardboard boxes, and inside, both pads are nested inside a thicker, semi-aerated foam typing, which adequately protected the pads during shipping, and even saved one of my pads from external damage. And inside the foam, we'll find the pad itself, which doesn't come with any kind of wrapper or protective layer on its silicone base, which isn't an issue per se, but it would have been nice to see a wrapper or a cover for the base, as in its current form and packaging style, the pad's accessories could stick or even potentially damage the pad's base. And on the topic of accessories, under the pad we'll find a small white package that contains a cleaning cloth and another package that includes an arm sleeve, which is a rather familiar typing, but it does perform well, and we'll talk more about why the sleeve is so familiar and more about its performance later in this video. Now, on the retail batch of the Seraph, the pad will include a set of Westlab black and orange skates as well as a set of grip tapes, but unfortunately my pre-production units only included the black versions of the Westlab skates due to some logistical issues, which is why the grip tapes are also absent on my units. Now, while this is admittedly a little disappointing, seeing as I've heard great things about the orange skates specifically, the black skates were actually surprisingly good, and we'll talk more about their design, durability, and performance later in this video. And lastly, for warranty, the Seraph has the expected 1-year manufacturer warranty, and you can find the terms and conditions for said warranty over on Statice's website. Moving on to build quality and QC, despite my units being pre-production units, the quality of both my units is actually surprisingly good, but they definitely do have some issues. Starting with the glass itself, not only is it a rather unique typing, it's also well manufactured, with no uneven areas or dead zones on the uncoated version, and no issues with the coating on the coated version. Sadly though, the same can't be said for the pad's bases, as the silicone material on it is completely flat with no texturing etched into it, meaning that air can get trapped underneath the base, causing the pad to slip and shift in some cases, and the base's installation also isn't the greatest, as both of my pre-production copies have bubbling due to improper application. Thankfully though, Statice is well aware of the issues and has already changed the base on the retail batch to a new type, which is still silicone but has a design or texturing etched into it, which in theory should allow the updated base to perform significantly better and anchor properly, as long as it's properly installed, that is. So hopefully the bases on the retail units will be better, but since I don't have a retail unit here, I can't speak to whether Statice has actually resolved their base issues or not, but considering that hard pad bases are pretty hard to mess up, I don't foresee any major issues on the updated retail versions, but we'll have to wait and see how good the implementation is. And the pad's edges are also well implemented, though they are a little steeper than I expected them to be, but we'll talk more about them in a moment. But overall, and aside from the bases, the overall QC and build quality of the Seraphs is great, as the glass material is well designed and implemented, which is surprising given the pad's pricing. And on that topic, let's talk about the Seraph's unique glass material next. For the pad's material, both versions of the Seraph are using a more traditional soda lime glass typing. However, they're using a very special version of this material called low iron float glass, which has a few benefits, specifically when it comes to its optical properties. Now, soda lime glass is one of, if not the most common material types used in hard pads today, and while this material does have some disadvantages compared to aluminosilicate or other more durable materials, its common nature doesn't necessarily mean it's a bad choice for the Seraph, as soda lime glass can perform very well as long as it's properly manufactured, processed, and tempered, that is. Now, inside soda lime glass, silica dioxide is the primary component along with sodium oxide, as it lowers the material's melting point to make the material easier to work with. Calcium oxide is also another notable component, as it acts as a stabilizer, improving the glass's chemical resistance and molecular structure. There are also trace amounts of other materials inside this glass typing, but most notably iron oxide, which, if you didn't know, is what gives soda lime glass typings their natural greenish tinting. But since this soda lime glass here is a low iron float type, a special process has been applied to the glass during its manufacturing process, which removes the majority of the iron oxide in it along with the other trace impurities from the material. This additional processing gives this glass superior light transmission and color fidelity compared to standard soda lime glass types, and notably this additional processing doesn't impact the material's strength, as it's just as durable as normal soda lime materials, meaning there's no negative to this glass typing aside from the increased manufacturing costs. This low iron float glass is the same type of material commonly used in display cases like those found in jewelry stores as well as in aquariums, as their improved optical properties makes them ideal for these use cases and many other use cases, as they don't distort or miscolor what's behind it, and this material unsurprisingly gives the Seraph the cleanest optics I've ever seen on a hard pad to date, which really highlights the pad's artwork and coloring. However, this improved material is a bit of a double-edged sword here, unfortunately, as the print quality on my pre-production units is a little pixelated. Now, on other glass types, print quality isn't as much of an issue, as its natural distortion of the glass will cover up a lower print quality, but the improved optics of his low iron float glass obviously doesn't, meaning that up close the design does look rather pixelated. Now, to be abundantly clear, this is by all means not a major issue per se, as you're not going to be staring at the pad's art this closely, and from afar the material's improved optics allows the art to look great and clear, but once you notice the pixelation on the printing you can't unsee it, and as such on the retail versions I hope Statice improved the print's resolution, and if they didn't, I hope on their future projects they do so, as using a lower resolution print on a pad with such optically optimized glass is a bit disappointing, and using a higher resolution print would improve the pad's design at all visual ranges in my opinion. However, while this special glass has fantastic optical properties, since it is still a soda lime typing, keep in mind it shares the same weaker molecular structure and inferior durability, impact, thermal, and chemical resistances compared to other more durable glass types, but as a trade-off this material has the aforementioned optical benefits, which is something I'm actually okay with in this use case, as the Seraph is optically speaking the cleanest and best looking hard pad I've seen to date, being vastly superior to the optics of stronger material types. And on the topic of durability, and as is traditional for a soda lime hard pad, the surface of the glass has been tempered to improve its durability, but notably, the tempering hasn't been done via the traditional thermal processing we often see used for this glass material type, as instead the material has been tempered via an ion exchange process, which is a first in my experience, as this process is commonly used on more durable material types, such as aluminosilicate glass. Now, if you're not familiar with this process, to simply explain it, during a rather complex processing, which is often done in a vacuum, in the pad surface, sodium ions are swapped for potassium ions, and due to their larger ionic radius, as the potassium ions are jammed into the glass's surface, they transform it into a layer of compressed stress, strengthening it and improving its durability, impact, thermal, and chemical resistances. Now, despite the more advanced processing, it still won't make the soda lime glass as strong as tempered aluminosilicate, for example, but it does significantly improve its overall durability compared to the traditional thermal tempering processes often used on this glass type. Now, obviously, this tempering process is more expensive than thermal tempering, but given its improved consistency and strength, I'm glad Statice utilized it here, as it gives this Seraph superior durability compared to other soda lime hard pads that have been thermal tempered. For surfacing, both versions of the Seraph use a familiar texturing style, similar to the surfacings you'll find on many other more speed-optimized hard pads, being the most similar to the Lock-On Odyssey's texturing, funnily enough, as the pad surface and texturing have a near-identical feel, at least when it comes to the uncoated version, as the coating applied to the other version of the Seraph does mute the surfacing quite a bit, increasing its speed significantly. But regardless of the coating and its impact, both pads' texturings are the same randomized, wrinkle-like style, which gives the pad's topography unique RA and RZ values, as the depth of the valleys between the peaks of the wrinkled ridges are quite pronounced, which gives this surfacing style a more textured feel, similar to that of a hardened leather, so to speak. Now, despite its familiarity, the interesting thing about the surfacing is that despite the Seraph using a soda lime glass type which can be etched in a variety of cheap ways, similar to the more advanced tempering process used here, the surface texturing on both versions of the Seraph is etched via chemical processing, which is also known as wet etching, which is the etching type commonly used on more durable material types such as aluminosilicate glass, not on traditional soda lime materials. Now, if you're not familiar with how wet etching works, the surface of the pad is dipped into an acid bath in which the acid eats away at the silica on the glass's surface via an isotropic reaction, which after a multi-stage process creates a uniform texture in the glass's surface. However, unlike dry etching processes which are fairly linear, wet etching processes depending on the number of stages, the acids used, the material typing, and several other factors, are much more variable, hence why we see so many different texturing styles on pads that utilize wet etching, as it can be tweaked and fine-tuned by the manufacturer. Another benefit to wet etching is it's a notable improvement over dry etching processes which commonly use sandblasting or lasers to etch a pad's texture, as these methods are rather prone to redeposition or consistency issues, which can result in dead zones, physical bumps, or uneven axis frictions in the pad's surface. Whereas wet etching processes, due to its chemical nature, are not only immune to the aforementioned redeposition issues, due to the reaction's isotropic nature, the etching is consistent across the pad's entire surface, meaning this etching type results in a more consistent etch, free of any dead zones or uneven axis frictions, while also having the benefit of being more customizable. However, just like the tempering process, wet etching is more expensive compared to dry etching. However, given its benefits, I'm glad to see Statice again choose the higher cost and higher quality manufacturing method here. Now, while the surfaces on both of my units are well implemented and etched, just as I saw on the Lock-On Odyssey, due to its design and since its surface topography is more flattened than what we've seen on other hard pad types, pressing your mouse into the pad surface doesn't increase the pad's frictions by a significant degree, meaning that both versions of the pad will maintain their speed optimized nature regardless of the skate type used or additional force added to the mouse, as there's no utilizable Z Z-axis friction to speak of here, just as we saw in the Lock-On Odyssey, which also uses a very similar surfacing type. Now, to be clear, this isn't a negative, as most speed-optimized hard pads feature surfacing texturings of this nature, but it's still something I wanted to mention, as hard pad surfacing types that allow for varying degrees of Z-axis friction are becoming more and more common, more so on control and balance hard pad types than speed-optimized ones, but regardless, I still wanted to mention this aspect to the pad surfacing. Moving on to skatewear, since the pad surface texturing is a smoother typing, the pad skatewear is average from my experience, though it's worth mentioning the uncoated version might have a slightly higher wear rate since there's no coating to mute or cover up the pad's texturing, but regardless from my experience, both versions of the Seraph have an average wear rate, so if you end up purchasing a Seraph, keep this in mind and be sure to replace your mouse's skates accordingly. And lastly, for sensor compatibility, I tested both versions of the Seraph with the Pixart 3395, 3950, 3955, and 3970 series sensors, along with the Logitech Hero 2 sensor as well, and over my testing I didn't run into any tracking, skipping, or other incompatibility issues, but that said, when it comes to the Hero 2 specifically, since we've seen this particular sensor have issues with other hard pad types, you still might have issues here on the Seraph, but to be clear, this is due to the oddities of the Hero 2, not the implementation of the Seraph surfacing. Now, as mentioned earlier, the Seraph is available both at uncoated and coated type, meaning that this segment is only going to apply to one version of the Seraph. Now, hard pad coatings can be applied in a variety of different methodologies, many of which we discussed here on the channel before, but notably, Statice is using a new coating type and application method here, as the coated Seraph is using an ion-bonded nano coating. Now, this coating type is bonded to the pad surface via a process similar to the surface's wet etching, as the pad is covered in a solution containing the coating's materials, and via a rather complex chemical process, the coating is covalently bonded to the material's surface in the form of a thin layer, which is a very unique application method I haven't seen utilized until now, at least to my knowledge. Now, this bonding process, at least on paper, is stronger than thermal bonded coatings, but it's not as strong as coatings applied via ion-assisted deposition, for example, as ionic bonding is stronger than the covalent bonding here. Meaning that in terms of durability, this nano coating falls in between thermal and IID coatings and will have good long-term performance on paper, just not to the same degree as an IID coating. Another unique aspect to the Seraph's coating is it has two key benefits compared to traditional coating types. Firstly, and as expected for most hard pad coatings, it improves the pad's moisture and debris resistance due to its oleophobic and hydrophobic typing, but secondly, and most notably, due to its material composition, it decreases the pad's friction coefficients, making the coated version of the Seraph faster than its uncoated counterpart. Now, while the coating does make one version of the Seraph faster than the other and improves its usage experience, I do wish the coating was applied via an IID process, as the thinness and bonding of the current coating does potentially raise some red flags in regards to the pad's long-term usage, as to my knowledge we haven't seen any other hard pad use this coating type yet, so we don't have any reference to its long-term durability, and if, and in the worst case, the coating does wear, given its alteration to the pad's friction coefficients, it'll be very noticeable as slow spots will develop in the pad's surface. But given that from a manufacturing perspective, this coating should be more durable than a thermal bonded coating, which already has pretty good durability in my experience, I assume the nano coating here will hold up over long-term use, but we'll have to wait and see just how well the coating holds up over long-term use in a real-world scenario. Moving on to performance profiles, the Seraph is described by Statice as featuring a low friction profile with a low sense of stopping power, which is well suited for high TTK games, which is a roundabout way of saying the pads are speed optimized, but particularly the coated version, as it is one of the fastest hard pads I've used in a while, and both pads' speed optimized performance profiles are further improved by the included skates, but we'll talk about them in a moment. And as mentioned in the surfacing segment, the pad's texturing style can't be utilized to increase the pad's friction coefficients by a significant degree, meaning that both versions of the pad will maintain their speed optimized nature regardless of the skate type used or any additional force added to movements, which is expected for a speed optimized hard pad. And as expected for a hard pad type, keep in mind that you can't use any kind of glass, metal, gem, or ceramic skate on the pads, as harder material skates can scratch or damage the surface, but you can use traditional PTFE, hardened PTFE, and UHMWPE material skates without issue, and seeing as these are the most common skate types used on hard pads, I'll be talking about their usage experience and performance profiles today. Starting off with the uncoated version of the Seraph and the pad's usage with standard 100% PTFE material skates, such as the included Westlab black skates. These skates complement the pad's speed-oriented nature the best, giving the pads the expected low degrees of initial dynamic and braking frictions, giving the pad a very speed-optimized performance profile that makes it very well suited for dynamic and tracking aim and game types. However, due to the lower overall friction profile of the pad, this skate type doesn't make the pad very well suited for static and flicking aim and game types. Technically speaking, it could be usable for this use case, but it's much better suited for dynamic and tracking aiming from my experience. However, this skate type, due to its material, has the lowest lifespan, as PTFE materials wear very quickly in any hard pad type, meaning that while they offer the fastest performance profile on the Seraphs, you'll have to keep a close eye on the skates and replace them whenever they wear down, as if the skates wear too much, the pad's performance profile will become inconsistent or be altered entirely. And for audio feedback when using PTFE skates, here's how a few types sound on the uncoated version of the Seraph. Moving on to the usage experience with hardened PTFE material skates, due to the hardening and additional processing, this skate type offers a more durable and controlled experience, which marginally increases the degrees of initial, dynamic, and braking frictions felt on the pad, slightly shifting its performance profile more towards a speed balance profile, but not enough where it will actually alter the pad's optimal use cases, as even with this skate type, the pad is best suited for dynamic and tracking aim and game types, less so for static and flicking aim and game types still. But again, technically it could still be used for this use case, but it's still better suited for a dynamic and tracking aimer from my experience, despite the skate's more controlled nature. But unlike 100% PTFE material skates, this skate type has the benefit of having a much longer lifespan, as the additional processing and hardening makes them more durable and more resistant to wear, meaning they'll offer more consistent performance over their extended lifespan compared to their pure PTFE counterparts, while also slightly increasing the pad's frictions. And for audio feedback when using hardened PTFE material skates, here's how a few of this skate types sound on the uncoated version of the Seraph. And lastly, when using UHMWPE or ultra-high molecular weight polyethylene material skates, due to their unique material and its higher friction coefficients, these skate types increase the degrees of initial, dynamic, and braking frictions on the pad by a decent degree, shifting the pad's performance profile more solidly to a speed balance one, making the pad more versatile and suitable for both dynamic and tracking, as well as static and flicking aim and game types. This material skate type also has the longest lifespan and durability, even when compared to hardened PTFE material skates, meaning that the performance profile offered by these skates will be the most consistent over their extended lifespan, while also making the pad more controllable. And for audio feedback when using UHMWPE material skate types, here's how a few of the skate types sound on the uncoated version of the Seraph. Moving on to the coated version of the Seraph, just to simplify this segment, the individual traits of each skate type still apply to the coated version, such as their durability and effect on the pad's performance. However, due to the nano coating applied to the surface, the pad's performance profiles do shift slightly. As with PTFE material skates, the performance profile shifts to a more speed-oriented profile, as it's faster than the uncoated version, still being best suited for dynamic and tracking game and aim types. Whereas with hardened PTFE material skates, the performance profile falls into the same speed performance profile, though it's slightly slower due to the skate's increased frictions, but not enough to alter the profile in my opinion, meaning the pad is again best suited for dynamic and tracking aim and game types. And lastly, with UHMWPE material skate types, the pad's performance profile shifts from the speed balance profile of the uncoated version to a speed profile here, as even with this material's higher friction coefficients, the pad is still very fast, making it best suited for unzipping unsurprisingly, dynamic and tracking aiming game types. And to give an example of just how fast the coded version of the Seraph is, even when using 8 of the XtraPad U9 Air 8mm dots, the pad was so fast I couldn't even use the pad for just general use, as even keeping my cursor on a button when I was trying to click or open a program was extremely difficult on the coded version of the Seraph, and the pad was borderline unusable for any kind of precision task when using very speed optimized skates like PTFE. So if you're going to get this version of the Seraph, keep in mind that the coded version is extremely fast, even when used with more controlled skate types. And as I alluded to earlier, there will be a slight difference in the textural and audio feedback of the two versions, as the uncoated version of the Seraph feels slightly more textured and is a little louder, while the coded version feels a little smoother and is a little quieter when it comes to skate feedback. Now, in my opinion, both versions of the Seraph are pretty smooth feeling, but if you're sensitive to texturing or don't like the roughness of some surfacing types, I'd recommend getting the coded version as it's a little more muted, as well as using skates with a buffering layer to mitigate any feedback felt from the pad surfacing. And as a note about hardened PTFE and UHMWPE material skates, these skate types do need to be worked into a hard pad surface for them to perform optimally, and you can do this by installing the skates on your mouse and then while firmly pressing them into the pad surface, make a large figure 8 motion with the mouse for around 40 seconds, and doing this will break in quote-unquote the skates, allowing them to perform as outlined a moment ago. Now, out of all the skate types I tested here on the Seraphs, I personally found UHMWPE material types to be the best quote-unquote, as I prefer a more controlled glide on my hard pads, but as I mentioned a moment ago, even with this skate type, both versions of the Seraph were very fast, a little too fast for my taste to be honest, specifically when it comes to the coded version, but for users that want that speed optimized experience, both versions of the Seraph will deliver that when paired with 100% PTFE or hardened PTFE material skates, especially the coded version. Moving on to the included skates, or skate I guess I should say in my case, both versions of the Seraph should include 20 Westlab black and orange skates, however my unit only included the black versions, so I'll only be talking about them today. For dimensions, these skates measure 6.5mm wide and around 0.7 plus minus 1mm tall, and have the traditional shaping similar to that found on XtraPad's dot skates, having a cylindrical body and a rounded surface, though notably the skate's body is a little thinner and the surface topography of the skate is more rounded. These skates also feature what appears to be a soft microporous polyurethane foam, SMPF for short, layering between the skate's body and its base adhesive, very similar to ones found on UWS and XtraPad skates, which acts as a buffering layer to help reduce the skate's degrees of audio and physical feedback when used on hard pads, which is a nice but expected feature to see on any skate included with a hard pad nowadays. And for material, these skates are an untreated PTFE typing, meaning they'll offer the fastest friction profile with the lowest lifespan due to their softer material. And from my testing, these skates performed very similar to an XtraPad Jade Air skate, having comparable degrees of speed, though the Westlabs were slightly faster due to their altered surface topography, but they performed well over my testing. However, they were far too fast for me to use reliably, especially on the coded version, hence why I opted to use more controlled skate types over the majority of my testing. But I will say on other more controlled pad types, these skates performed great, and for people who want speed, they're a great pairing with either versions of the Seraph, just keep in mind their lower lifespan due to their softer material typing. And in terms of audio feedback for the stock skates, here's how the stock Westlab black skates sound on both the coded and uncoated version of the Seraph. For edges, both versions of the Seraph have a beveled edge typing, which is an improvement over the traditional rounded edges found on many other hard pad types. But the edge beveling here, oddly, is a bit of a steeper style than what's been implemented on other hard pad types, but given the glass's 1.5mm thickness, I assume they were forced to make the edges in this more aggressive style, meaning that the transition from the desk to the pad surface is a bit steeper than it is on other hard pads that have a more gradual edge beveling. Thankfully though, despite its more more aggressive style, this doesn't add any additional drag or friction on movements up or down the edges of the pad, but it does mean that some skate types can get stuck on the edges of the pad in some rare cases. But regardless, the edge styling here is superior to that of the rounded edges we've seen used on other hard pad types, and the implementation here is good, though personally speaking I'd like to see the edge beveling be a little more gradual in its curvature to improve the desk to pad transition, but this is a pretty minimal nitpick overall, and the implementation of the edges here on the Seraph is pretty good. For base implementation, as I mentioned earlier, since my pads are pre-production units, I have the older base style which has some issues as its application is pretty bad as there are air bubbles underneath it, and due to its completely flat surface it doesn't anchor itself fully to desktop surfaces as air can get stuck underneath it even though the whole base is silicone. But as I mentioned earlier, Statice is already aware of this issue and the retail batch Seraphs will have a new updated polyurethane base that has a gorgeous texturing on it, and since this base won't be completely flat, air trapped underneath it shouldn't be an issue, which should allow the new base to anchor itself firmly to most desktop surfaces. However, since I don't have a retail batch, my thoughts here are purely speculative, but considering many other hard pad types have used similar base styles to great success, I don't see any major issues with the updated base, but we'll have to wait and see how the bases on the retail units perform once they arrive to customers. For the effects of moisture, as expected, seeing as there are two different versions of the Seraph, the usage experience of each pad will vary slightly when it comes to how they handle moisture. Now on the uncoated version, the flattened texturing style technically mitigates some of the detriments of moisture, but despite this, the pad still does become very sticky when exposed to sweat or other moisture sources, which does significantly impact the pad's usage experience. Whereas on the coated version, as expected due to the nano coating's oleophobic and hydrophobic nature, this version of the pad handles moisture much better than the uncoated version and can be used without an arm sleeve, but just like all other hard pad types, despite the coating, if the pad is exposed to a lot of moisture it can become a little sticky, but this is commonplace for all hard pad types. Now thankfully, Statice was aware of the potential moisture related issues here on the Seraphs and included an arm sleeve with the pads, which is a great attention to detail as it helps to mitigate any skin stick issues and improves the pad's usage experiences, but we'll talk more about the included sleeve in a moment. Moving on to the effects of dust and debris, much like the two respective versions' moisture resistances and usage experiences, the usage experience of both pads differs slightly when it comes to the effects of debris and oils. Now on both pad types, larger debris particles such as pet fur or crumbs are an issue area, as expected for any hard pad type, meaning that cleaning the pad before and during use is recommended, and you can do so via the included cleaning cloth or with the generic microfiber cloth. And for smaller debris particles such as dust, both the pad surface texturings handles dust and smaller debris particles quite well, but over long-term usage, debris can build up inside the valleys in the pad's texturing, which can potentially cause performance issues and is why cleaning the pad frequently is recommended. And for the effects of sweat, oils, and other debris sources, this is where the two pads differ, as the uncoated version is more susceptible to buildup in its surfacing, as every uncoated pad is, meaning slow spots can develop on the pad's surfacing over time as sweat and oils from your hands will mix with debris stuck in the surfacing, causing the aforementioned slow spots, whereas on the coated version, due to its oleophobic nature, it's much more resistant to said buildup, but it's not completely immune as slow spots can still develop over very long-term use if the pad isn't properly cared for. As such, and as I recommend for all hard pad types, whether they're coated or uncoated, cleaning the pad with the included microfiber cloth as frequently as possible is highly recommended, and I'd also recommend deep cleaning the pad at least once a month, as doing so can help to prevent debris buildup in the surface texturing, and you can do so by wetting a microfiber cloth with lukewarm water and cleaning the surfacing as needed. But unlike many other hard pad types, since both pads include an arm sleeve, said potential buildup issues can be almost entirely mitigated, so I'd highly recommend using the included sleeve, which we'll talk about next. But if you do still notice any kind of buildup on the pad surface, you can clean it very easily with the aforementioned methods. And lastly, for the included arm sleeve, this sleeve is a very familiar typing as mentioned earlier, as it's almost identical to the ones G-Wolves includes with their mice, as it's the same palm-arm hybrid typing, but has a slightly altered material blend of 75% nylon and 25% spandex, which is a better material blend than G-Wolves sleeves, which allows them to be a little more durable without the fraying issues we found on other similar sleeve types. And for texturing, the sleeve is mostly flat, though at the wrist area it does have a little bit more of a linear stitching, meaning that on soft pad types it might have a higher than expected degree of friction, but for hard pad usage the sleeve will be fine by all means. And over my testing, the sleeve and all other sleeve types for that matter performed well on both versions of the Seraph. However, I will say these stock sleeves do lack a rubber banding at their top, meaning that the sleeve could slip down someone's arm in some use cases, but over my testing the sleeve felt fine and performed well. And I will say I'm really happy to see a sleeve included here, as for some reason many other hard pad brands don't include sleeves with their products, which is really confusing and disappointing given their benefits, and I hope we see Statice continue to include them on their future releases. Alright, in closing, for this being the first hard pads released by Statice, I'm actually quite impressed with what they've cooked up. As for their pricing, you get a very solid quality pad with great accessories, at least on the retail batches, and visually speaking, the pads have the best optics I've ever seen on a hard pad, and the pad's physical design with the low iron float soda lime glass, wet etch texturing and ion bonded nano coating is great, and a welcome surprise given the pad's more lower price point. The included Westlab skates are great, though I wish I got to try the orange versions, and the pad's edge beveling is a great attention to detail, though its curvature is a bit aggressive, and while the pads do have some issues with moisture and debris buildup, the included arm sleeves largely nullifies these issue areas, and as such I'm very happy to see an arm sleeve included with the pads. But that said, the pads aren't perfect, as the print quality on the pre-production units I have is a little low res, which is sadly highlighted by the clear glass typing, and hopefully we see higher quality printing on Statice's future releases. The pad's coating has questionable long-term durability due to its new application typing. Theoretically speaking, it should be more durable than a thermal coating, but we don't really have any data to prove this as of yet, so we'll have to wait for long-term use to see how the pad's coating holds up. And as I mentioned earlier, the bases on my pre-production units are pretty bad, but thankfully this has already been fixed on the retail batches and will be fixed on their future releases. But overall, and despite these being pre-production units, I'm still quite impressed with what Statice has cooked up here. As for the Seraph being their first ever release, they did a great job here in all honesty, and this is a great stepping stone for their future products, as with a couple tweaks and more organized logistics, their pads will be borderline perfect in all honesty. But we'll have to see what Statice's next project will be, but they'll be a brand I'll be keeping a close eye on going forward for sure, and hopefully their next release will be more on the balanced or controlled side of the performance spectrum, as the Seraphs are a bit too fast for my taste. But regardless, they are very impressive pads, and I'm very excited to see what they cook up next. But with that, that is everything for today's episode of the mel0n Review. Thank you very much for watching, and thanks again for Statice for sending over the coated and uncoated versions of the Seraph for review. If you enjoyed the review and want to support my efforts on the channel with these in-depth reviews, the teardown project, and the guides, consider becoming a member here on YouTube, as that is the best way to directly support the channel, and being a member gives you early, ad-free access to all upcoming content. So if you want to support what I do here on the channel, become a member today. Thanks again for watching my review of the Statice Seraph, and I'll catch you all in the next episode of the mel0n Review. Peace.